There is an ordinary part of the garden most people keep overlooking. Not the fancy raised bed. Not the seed rack in spring. Not the tomato cage row everybody photographs in July. I mean that quiet patch of ground that could be doing useful work every single year, but instead gets treated like empty space until somebody has time, money, or energy to start over from scratch again. That patch matters more than people think, because if you are tired of sowing everything over and over, tired of spending the early season racing the calendar, tired of pulling a crop once, and then watching that bed go dead until next year's plans begin all over again, perennial vegetables start looking less like a novelty and more like old common sense returning to the yard. And that is what this is really about. Not exotic gardening, not a trendy food forest sales pitch, not pretending annual vegetables do not matter. This is about one of the most practical shifts a home grower can make, taking an ordinary piece of ground, giving it to the right plants, and turning it into repeated harvest instead of repeated rework. That is the hidden power here. A perennial vegetable is not just a plant that comes back. It is labor you do not have to repeat in full. Soil you do not have to disturb every season. Watering patterns you come to understand. Harvest windows that return. Food that begins showing up before the busiest annual beds have even found their rhythm. And once you really understand that, you stop asking only what can I grow this year. You start asking what can keep feeding this place year after year with less starting over. That one question changes the whole tone of a garden. So I want to walk through 5 perennial vegetables worth growing for repeated harvests. But I do not want to do it like a seed catalog list. I want to show you why these plants matter, what kind of work they save, where they fit, what mistakes people make with them, and why an ordinary long-lived bed can become one of the steadiest sources of food and confidence on a home place. And before we get into the 5 plants, there is one correction worth making early. People sometimes hear perennial vegetables and imagine lazy gardening. Plant it once, forget it forever, food appears by magic. That is not the truth. Perennials still need thoughtful placement, decent soil, occasional dividing or cleaning up, and the discipline not to smother them with neglect or crowd them with bad companions. But compared with starting from seed every spring, thinning, replanting, chasing weather windows, and rebuilding a bed from scratch, perennials often ask for a different kind of work. Less frantic, less repetitive, more settled. And settled work has its own power. The first plant on this list is asparagus. And asparagus may be the purest example of why patience can become one of the best tools in a food garden. A lot of people avoid asparagus because it asks you to think beyond one season. You plant crowns or start from seed. If you are truly patient, prepare the bed well, keep weeds down, and then wait far longer than modern gardening culture likes to wait. That is exactly why asparagus is so valuable. It forces you out of the constant annual rush and into a different relationship with the ground. When asparagus is happy, it becomes one of the earliest serious harvests of the year. Not a leaf here and there, not a garnish. Real food. Thick or slender spears pushing up when most of the garden is still gathering itself. That timing matters. It comes when people are hungry for that the season has turned. Now here is the mistake people make with asparagus. They either harvest too hard too early because they are impatient, or they tuck it into some casual corner and forget that this is a long-term planting that deserves a real home. Asparagus wants drainage, sun, and a bed you are willing to leave alone. Not trampled, not dug up, not shaded out by every ambitious annual experiment that wanders too close. If you give it that, it pays you back for years. And the repeated harvest is not the only gift. The bed itself starts becoming part of your mental map of the place. You know where the first spears will appear. You know when the ferny growth needs to be left alone so the roots can recharge. You stop seeing the garden as one flat annual project and start seeing layers of time inside it. That may sound philosophical, but it turns practical very quickly. A good asparagus bed means one less spring crop you have to start from scratch. One more reason the season begins with food instead of just chores. The second perennial vegetable is rhubarb. And this is where some people object immediately because they think of rhubarb as pie plant and not a real vegetable. Fine. Let them object. It is still one of the most perennial plants a home place can grow. And one of the easiest ways to understand the hidden value of repeated return. Rhubarb occupies space with authority. family. Big leaves, thick stalks, a presence you can spot from across the yard. Once established, it asks for less fuss than many annual crops, and rewards you during that hungry gap when winter stores are dwindling, and summer abundance is still a promise. That alone earns it respect. But the deeper lesson with rhubarb is this: some of the most useful garden plants are not the ones you harvest every week for months. Some are the ones that appear faithfully at exactly the moment they are needed. Rhubarb is one of those. It comes in with sharpness, substance, and real kitchen value. When fresh ingredients can still feel scarce. The usual mistake is not feeding it enough organic matter over time, or planting it where it bakes and dries beyond reason, or harvesting too aggressively from a young plant. Rhubarb is sturdy, but sturdy does not mean careless treatment produces greatness. Give it room. Give it decent soil. Mulch it. Keep it from being swallowed by weeds or squeezed by overcrowded beds. And then notice what it teaches. A perennial patch does not have to look delicate to be productive. It can look almost old-fashioned in the best sense. Broad leaves, thick stalks. A clump that seems to deepen into itself every season. Not flashy. Dependable. That dependability is part of the hidden power of perennials. They are often not the crops that make beginners feel clever on day one. They are the crops that make experienced growers feel relieved in year 3. The third plant is walking onion, sometimes called Egyptian onion. And if ever there was a humble plant that ordinary things can become surprisingly valuable when understood properly, it is this one. Walking onions do not seduce people with glamour. They are not the crop folks brag about first. But they are practical in a way that goes deep. Green tops when you need them. Small bulbs when you let them mature. Top sets that form above ground and bend over to start the next generation. A patch that slowly expands and gives you both food and propagation without asking for seed packets every year. This is what I mean by hidden power. A simple onion that keeps renewing itself, starts changing how you cook and how you think. You stop treating every chopped green onion as a store purchase or a spring-only luxury. You have a patch. You walk out. You cut what you need. Maybe not enough to feed a reunion supper, but enough to flavor daily life. Enough to keep the kitchen tied to the yard. And that is where self-reliance becomes real. Not in heroic speeches. In handfuls. Now the mistake people make with walking onions is either ignoring their spreading habit or underestimating their usefulness. Because the bulbs are not giant storage onions. That misses the point entirely. Walking onions are not trying to replace every onion. They are trying to make sure you have an onion presence in the garden with very little annual restart. That is worth a lot. Plant them where you can let them naturalize a bit without becoming a nuisance. Harvest greens regularly, divide or relocate clumps when needed, and pay attention to how they move. They teach a different gardening
less
rhythm.
formal,
less rigid row crop thinking, more observation, more reuse, more acceptance, that a useful plant can also behave like a living colony instead of a perfectly obedient line item. The fourth perennial vegetable is sorrel. And sorrel is one of the best examples of how a small ordinary leaf can completely change the usefulness of a garden bed. If you have never grown sorrel, it may not sound exciting on paper. It is leafy. It is leafy. Perennial. Not exactly the thing that gets giant displays at garden centers. But that modesty is part of its strength. Sorrel comes back early. Handles cool weather well. And gives you a bright, sharp flavor. At a time when many people are still waiting on lettuce. Still thinning spinach. Or still wishing the annual beds had more to offer. The correction here is important. Do not judge a perennial vegetable only by whether it behaves like a bulk staple. Some perennials earn their place by adding regular harvest value in smaller amounts, meals again and again. Sorrel is one of those. A little in soups, sauces, egg dishes, mixed greens, or anything that benefits from a clean sour lift can go a long way. And because it returns, you are not coaxing that early harvest every single year. That matters more than people think. Early food is precious. Not just because of hunger, but because of morale. A garden that gives you something before the main season arrives feels alive in a different way. Sorrel is one of those plants that keeps reminding you the yard is working. Even when the summer crops are still only plants. As for mistakes, people either let sorrel go old without cutting it regularly, or they plant one tiny clump and forget where it is, or they overlook it because it is not loud. Quiet plants often make the best home companions. They are there when you need them. They do not demand a yearly campaign. They just keep returning if you respect what they are. and respect often looks like good placement. Give sorrel a spot with decent moisture and enough light. Divide it when clumps get crowded. Harvest often enough to keep fresh growth. Then let it become part of your ordinary cooking life. Instead of a curiosity you tried once and forgot. The fifth perennial vegetable is artichoke in milder climates, or globe artichoke, where winters allow it to persist well enough to earn true perennial status. Now I know that one comes with a climate warning, and that not every perennial vegetable is perennial. But where artichokes can live, they bring something special. They are bold plants. They are bold, architectural, strong, silvery. And they produce food that feels almost too elegant for how practical the plant itself can be once established. An artichoke patch can be beautiful, but beauty is not the main argument. The main argument is that a substantial edible plant can return without requiring you to rebuild the whole performance every spring. That is a pattern worth noticing. People often overcomplicate gardening by assuming useful crops must all pass through the same annual routine. Start trays, harden up, transplant, pull, harvest, reset. There is nothing wrong with that cycle. Much of the garden will always run that way. But perennials remind you that another rhythm exists. Prepare well, place wisely, maintain thoughtfully, harvest repeatedly. Artichokes fit that lesson beautifully. Now the mistake with artichokes is pretending local climate does not matter. If your winters are too severe and you do not have a workable strategy, then artichokes may not behave like the perennial you hoped for. That is not failure. That is failure. A wise gardener does not force every romantic idea onto the wrong ground. But if you are in a place where artichokes can settle in, give them room, and do not underestimate how much presence one established clump can bring to the harvest, year after year. Now those are 5 worthy perennial vegetables. But the real lesson underneath them is bigger than the list. Perennial vegetables change the economics of effort. That is the phrase I keep coming back to. Not just money, though they can save money. The economics of your time, your spring energy, your seed starting space, your soil disturbance, your transplant workload. They let you invest once in a more lasting way, and then collect returns across seasons instead of demanding full repayment every year. That does not mean annual vegetables of course lose their place. Tomatoes, beans, corn, squash, peppers, and all the rest still matter. But when a garden is built entirely on annual urgency, the whole thing can start feeling like a treadmill. Beautiful, productive, exhausting. Perennial's slow part of that wheel. Slowing part of the wheel is sometimes exactly what keeps people gardening because one of the least discussed truths in home food growing people do not usually quit because they hate harvest. They quit because the restarting becomes overwhelming. The timing, the replanting, the weeds in an empty bed that has not yet become food, that has not yet that every year begins from zero. Perennial vegetables answer that perennial vegetables answer that useful way. In a grounded, there is also a practical emotional benefit that does not get perennial vegetables calm the start of the year. When all your attention is tied to indoor sowing, bed preparation, and trying to time every annual crop just right, it is easy for the garden to feel like a test. You are either passing perennial beds interrupt that feeling. Perennial beds they remind you that not every useful thing depends on perfect timing. Some things are already rooted. Some things are already on their way up. Some things are already on their way up. Keep a gardener from making foolish rushed and that steadiness shows up in the kitchen too. Repeated harvests are not only about volume. They are not only about volume. A handful of sorrel when soup handful of sorrel when a few onions brightens without opening the pantry or driving to town. Rhubarb ready when you need something fresh and sharp when you need something fresh and sharp after a long stretch of stored food. Asparagus turning supper into spring These are small returns each time. These are small returns repeated, but become one of the most satisfying forms of abundance. Another thing worth understanding is that perennial vegetables often teach better restraint than annuals. If you push too hard or make a mistake, you can usually tell yourself you will fix it with perennials next year. You think longer. With perennials, you pay more attention to placement, soil building, spacing, and long-term consequences. Because you know the plant is meant to stay. That mindset can improve your whole gardening practice. You become slower to overcrowd. You become slower to thoughtlessly. Slower to exhaust a bed for one season's enthusiasm. And if you are working with limited space, that does not disqualify you. That does not disqualify you. It just means the choice matters more. It just means the choice matters more. A contained onion patch, sorrel bed, a well-placed sorrel bed, asparagus run, or one narrow asparagus can still change the feel of a small garden. Perennial growing is not reserved for people with acres. It belongs to anyone willing to dedicate a piece of the landscape to return instead of turnover. No, they say everything has to begin from zero. Not everything has to begin from zero. Some things can stay put and get better. Some things can keep showing up. Some things can keep showing up. That is not laziness. That is not laziness. Now there are a few practical rules that make perennial vegetables more rewarding instead of more disappointing. First, choose the site carefully. Because these plants are not a one-season fling. If you plant asparagus where you will want to till next year, or walking onions where constant foot traffic crushes them, or rhubarb where a future fence project will tear the bed apart. You create conflict before the plant has had a chance to serve you. Perennials reward commitment. Give them a home. Not a temporary parking place. Feed the bed like you mean to keep it. Long-lived crops appreciate soil that improves instead of depletes. Mulch, weed control, occasional division when needed. All of that matters. Perennial does not mean immortal under neglect. It means the plant has a longer arc if you support it. Harvest with restraint early and confidence later. One of the worst mistakes is treating a young perennial planting like a mature one. Let asparagus build. Let rhubarb establish. Let clumps size up. The patience feels expensive at first. Impatience is usually more expensive. Learn the harvest rhythm of each plant. Repeated harvest is not random. Some crops want steady cutting. Some want a season of restraint followed by a period of gathering. Some want division every few years to stay vigorous. The real power is not just that they return. It is that you begin to know how they return. And once you know that, the yard becomes more readable. You stop gardening by generic advice alone. You start gardening by relationship. This is one reason I think perennial vegetables appeal so strongly to practical growers who have been at it a while. There is less performance. Less chasing novelty for its own sake. More building useful patterns. More paying attention to what earns its keep year after year. That phrase matters too. Earns its keep. Every garden has limited room. So a perennial vegetable should not live there just because it sounds interesting in a book. It should live there. Because it gives enough food. Because it gives enough timing advantage. Enough pleasure. Enough reliability to justify that permanent invitation. That is why these five stand out. Asparagus gives a true early harvest and long return. Rhubarb gives strong seasonal value when fresh food still feels rare. Walking onions provide ongoing greens and replant themselves into deeper usefulness. Sorrel gives early repeated leaf very little annual effort. Artichokes, where turn one established planting into a repeated and substantial reward. Different forms. Same principle. An ordinary patch of ground can do more for you when you stop asking it to start over every spring. And if you want to deepen this even further, start noticing where perennial vegetables belong in the wider shape of the place. Near the kitchen for quick cutting. Along an edge where annual tilling would be awkward anyway. In a bed that gets early attention because those first harvests matter. Around the margins of a larger garden so they become part of the structure. Not just occupants. Perennials often work best when they are woven into the place instead of treated like afterthoughts. That is when the hidden power becomes visible. You walk out in spring. And food is already there. You cut onions without sowing them that month. You pull sorrel while the annual greens are still catching up. You wait for asparagus because you know exactly where it lives and exactly what comes next. You harvest rhubarb from a clump that now feels as permanent as the path beside it. That kind of continuity does something to a person. It makes the garden feel less like a yearly gamble and more like a living inheritance you are building in real time. Not an inheritance in a grand dramatic sense. I mean the ordinary kind. A bed that will still be productive after several hard seasons. A patch you understand better than you did 3 years ago. A clump you can divide and share. A food source that becomes part of family memory because it keeps being there. That is not small. And in a world that keeps pushing people toward more consumption, more restarting, buying the same function again in a different package. There is something deeply grounding about a plant that says, Settle me
and
well,
I will keep returning.
and I will keep returning.
That is old practical knowledge, speaking through roots.
So if you are planning this season, and everything feels like another list of annual chores,
consider giving one ordinary patch of ground to a longer promise.
Maybe asparagus if you are ready to think ahead.
Maybe rhubarb if you want a bold, reliable clump.
Maybe walking onions if daily kitchen usefulness matters most.
Maybe sorrel
if you want early leaves with very little drama.
Maybe artichokes
if your climate lets them become what they can be.
You do not need to plant all five at once.
But I would strongly suggest planting at least one perennial vegetable with the intention of learning it well.
Because once you feel that first repeated harvest,
you did not have to start over from seed this spring.
Something shifts.
The garden stops feeling like a series of seasonal emergencies
and starts feeling more like a partnership with time.
One final practical note is this.
Do not let romance outrun fit.
A perennial bed only becomes powerful
when the plants actually suit the place.
Wet ground may suit one crop and rot another.
Deep shade may turn a hopeful planting into a long disappointment.
Hungry soil may need rebuilding before a long-term bed is worth trusting.
So before you plant,
watch the light.
Watch where water stands.
Notice where wind scours.
And think about how you move through the yard.
If you place perennial vegetables where they naturally cooperate with the place,
instead of constantly fighting it,
repeated harvest stops being an idea
and becomes a habit.
And that habit is really the goal.
Not one impressive harvest photo.
Not one season of trying everything.
A habit of walking out,
noticing what has returned,
and cutting food from plants that
already know their place.
Few things make a home garden feel more mature than that.
If you have children,
neighbors,
or anyone younger watching how food is grown,
perennial vegetables teach something quietly valuable too.
They show that not every reward comes from fast results. Some rewards come from care that stays put.
From seasons stacking on one another.
From trust built between a person and a patch of ground. That lesson belongs in a garden just as much as the harvest does.
And once you learn that rhythm,
even a modest yard starts feeling less temporary,
less dependent on
spring energy,
and more like a place that remembers your work
and answers it back with food steadily.
And I would honestly love to know which perennial vegetable has earned its place for you,
or which one you think would in your climate.
Some people swear by asparagus
and would never give up the bed.
Some love rhubarb
because nothing else announces the season quite the same way. Some value walking onions precisely because they are so humble and useful.
And there are always growers who have a local perennial favorite
that deserves more attention than it gets.
Those are the conversations
worth having.
Because this kind of gardening gets wiser
when people compare what truly keeps returning. Plant for repeat, not just for novelty. Build one bed that remembers what it is doing. Then let that ordinary patch of ground prove how powerful settled food can be.